Book 3. Before speaking of the different forms of government, let us try to fix the exact sense of the word, which has not yet been very clearly explained. 1. Government in general. I warn the reader that this chapter requires careful reading, and that I am unable to make myself clear to those who refuse to be attentive. Every free action is produced by the concurrence of two causes, one moral, i.e. the will which determines the act, the other physical, i.e. the power which executes it. When I walk towards an object, it is necessary first that I should will to go there, and, in the second place, that my feet should carry me. If a paralytic wills to run, and an active man wills not to, they will both stay where they are. The body politic has the same motive powers. Here too force and will are distinguished, will under the name of legislative power, and force under that of executive power. Without their concurrence, nothing is, or should be, done. We have seen that the legislative power belongs to the people, and can belong to it alone. It may, on the other hand, readily be seen, from the principles laid down above, that the executive power cannot belong to the generality as legislator or sovereign, because it consists wholly of particular acts which fall outside the competency of the law, and consequently of the sovereign, whose acts must always be laws. The public force therefore needs an agent of its own to bind it together, and set it to work under the direction of the general will, to serve as means of communication between the state and the sovereign, and to do for the collective person more or less what the union of soul and body does for man. Here we have what is, in the state, the basis of government, often wrongly confused with the sovereign, whose minister it is. What then is government? An intermediate body set up between the subjects and the sovereign to secure their mutual correspondence, charged with the execution of the laws and the maintenance of liberty, both civil and political. The members of this body are called magistrates or kings, that is to say, governors, and the whole body bears the name prince. Thus, those who hold that the act by which a people puts itself under a prince is not a contract are certainly right. It is simply and solely a commission, an employment, in which the rulers, mere officials of the sovereign, exercise in their own name the power of which it makes them depositories. This power it can limit, modify, or recover at pleasure, for the alienation of such a right is incompatible with the nature of the social body, and contrary to the end of association. I call then government, or supreme administration, the legitimate exercise of the executive power, and prince or magistrate the man or the body entrusted with that administration. In government resides the intermediate forces whose relations make up that of the whole to the whole, or the sovereign to the state. This last relation may be represented as that between the extreme terms of a continuous proportion, which has government as its mean proportional. The government gets from the sovereign the order it gives the people, and, for the state to be properly balanced, there must, when everything is reckoned in, be equality between the product or power of the government taken in itself, and the product or power of the citizens, who are on the one hand sovereign, and on the other subject. Furthermore, none of these terms can be altered without the equality being instantly destroyed. If the sovereign desires to govern, or the magistrate to give laws, or if the subjects refuse to obey, disorder takes the place of regularity. Force and will no longer act together, and the state is dissolved and falls into despotism or anarchy. Lastly, as there is only one mean proportional between each relation, there is also only one good government possible for a state. But, as countless events may change the relations of a people, not only may different governments be good for different peoples, but also for the same people at different times. In attempting to give some idea of the various relations that may hold between these two extreme terms, I shall take as an example the number of a people, which is the most easily expressible. Suppose the state is composed of 10,000 citizens. The sovereign can only be considered collectively and as a body, but each member, as being a subject, is regarded as an individual. Thus the sovereign is to the subject as 10,000 to 1, i.e., each member of the state has as his share only a 10,000th part of the sovereign authority, although he is wholly under its control. If the people numbers 100,000, the condition of the subject undergoes no change, and each equally is under the whole authority of the laws, while his vote, being reduced to 100,000th part, has 10 times less influence in drawing them up. The subject, therefore, remaining always a unit, the relation between him and the sovereign increases with the number of the citizens. From this it follows that, the larger the state, the less the liberty. When I say the relation increases, I mean that grows more unequal. Thus, the greater it is in the geometrical sense, the less relation there is in the ordinary sense of the word. In the former sense, the relation, considered according to quantity, is expressed by the quotient. In the latter, considered according to identity, it is reckoned by similarity. Now, the less relation the particular wills have to the general will, that is, morals and manners to laws, the more should the repressive force be increased. The government, then, to be good, should be proportionally stronger as the people is more numerous. On the other hand, as the growth of the state gives the dispositaries of the public authority more temptations and chances of abusing their power, the greater the force with which the government ought to be endowed for keeping the people in hand, the greater too should be the force at the disposal of the sovereign for keeping the government in hand. I am speaking not of absolute force, but of the relative force of the different parts of the state. It follows from this double relation that the continuous proportion between the sovereign, the prince, and the people is by no means an arbitrary idea, but a necessary consequence of the nature of the body politic. It follows further that one of the extreme terms, viz., the people, as subject, being fixed and represented by unity, whenever the duplicate ratio increases or diminishes, the simple ratio does the same, and is changed accordingly. From this we see that there is not a single unique and absolute form of government, but as many governments differing in nature as there are states differing in size. If, ridiculing this system, anyone were to say that, in order to find the mean proportional and give form to the body of the government, it is only necessary, according to me, to find the square root of the number of the people, I should answer that I am here taking this number only as an instance, that the relations of which I am speaking are not measured by the number of men alone, but generally by the amount of action, which is a combination of a multitude of causes, and that, further, if to save words, I borrow for a moment the terms of geometry, I am, none the less, well aware that moral quantities do not allow of geometrical accuracy. The government is on a small scale what the body politic, which includes it is on a great one. It is a moral person, endowed with certain faculties, active like the sovereign and passive like the state, and capable of being resolved into other similar relations. This accordingly gives rise to a new proportion, within which there is yet another, according to the arrangement of the magistracies, till an indivisible middle term is reached, i.e., a single ruler or supreme magistrate, who may be represented in the midst of this progression as the unity between the fractional and the ordinal series. Without encumbering ourselves with this multiplication of terms, let us rest content with regarding government as a new body within the state, distinct from the people and the sovereign, and intermediate between them. There is between these two bodies this essential difference, that the state exists by itself, and the government only through the sovereign. Thus, the dominant will of the prince is, or should be, nothing but the general will or the law. His force is only the public force concentrated in his hands, and as soon as he tries to base any absolute and independent act on his own authority, the tie that binds the whole together begins to be loosened. If, finally, the prince should come to have a particular will more active than the will of the sovereign, and should employ the public force in his hands in obedience to this particular will, there would be, so to speak, two sovereigns, one rightful and the other actual. The social union would evaporate instantly, and the body politic would be dissolved. However, in order that the government may have a true existence, and a real life distinguishing it from the body of the state, and in order that all its members may be able to act in concert and fulfill the end for which it was set up, it may have a particular personality, a sensibility common to its members, and a force and will of its own making for its preservation. This particular existence implies assemblies, councils, power and deliberation, and decision, rights, titles, and privileges belonging exclusively to the prince and making the office of magistrate more honorable in proportion as it is more troublesome. The difficulties lie in the manner of so ordering the subordinate whole within the whole, that it in no way alters the general constitution by affirmation of its own, and always distinguishes the particular force it possesses, which is destined to aid in its preservation, from the public force, which is destined to the preservation of the state, and, in a word, is always ready to sacrifice the government to the people, and never to sacrifice the people to the government. Furthermore, although the artificial body of the government is the work of another artificial body, and has, we may say, only a borrowed and subordinate life, this does not prevent it from being able to act with more or less vigor or promptitude, or from being, so to speak, in more or less robust health. Finally, without departing directly from the end for which it was instituted, it may deviate more or less from it, according to the manner of its constitution. From all these differences arise the various relations which the government ought to bear to the body of the state, according to the accidental and particular relations by which the state itself is modified. For often the government that is best in itself will become the most pernicious, if the relations in which it stands have altered according to the defects of the body politic to which it belongs. 2. The constituent principle in the various forms of government. To set forth the general cause of the above differences, we must here distinguish between government and its principle, as we did before between the state and the sovereign. The body of the magistrate may be composed of a greater or a less number of members. We said that the relation of the sovereign to the subjects was greater in proportion as the people was more numerous. And, by a clear analogy, we may say the same of the relation of the government to the magistrates. But the total force of the government, being always that of the state, is invariable, so that, the more of this force it expends on its own members, the less it has left to employ on the whole people. The more numerous the magistrates, therefore, the weaker the government. This principle being fundamental, we must do our best to make it clear. In the person of the magistrate, we can distinguish three essentially different wills. First, the private will of the individual, tending only to his personal advantage. Secondly, the common will of the magistrates, which is relative solely to the advantage of the prince, and may be called corporate will, being general in relation to the government, and particular in relation to the state, of which the government forms part. And, in the third place, the will of the people or the sovereign will, which is general both in relation to the state regarded as the whole and to the government regarded as a part of the whole. In a perfect act of legislation, the individual or particular will should be at zero. The corporate will belonging to the government should occupy a very subordinate position, and, consequently, the general or sovereign will should always predominate and should be the sole guide of all the rest. According to the natural order, on the other hand, these different wills become more active in proportion as they are concentrated. Thus, the general will is always the weakest, the corporate will second, and the individual will strongest of all, so that in the government each member is first of all himself, then a magistrate, and then a citizen, in an order exactly the reverse of what the social system requires. This granted, if the whole government is in the hands of one man, the particular and the corporate will are wholly united, and consequently, the latter is at its highest possible degree of intensity. But as the use of which the force is put depends on the degree reached by the will, and as the absolute force of the government is invariable, it follows that the most active government is that of one man. Suppose, on the other hand, we unite the government with the legislative authority, and make the sovereign prince also, and all the citizens so many magistrates, then the corporate will, being confounded with the general will, can possess no greater activity than that will, and must leave the particular will as strong as it possibly can. Thus, the government, having always the same absolute force, will be at the lowest point of its relative force or activity. These relations are incontestable, and there are other considerations which still further confirm them. We can see, for instance, that each magistrate is more active in the body to which he belongs than each citizen in that to which he belongs, and that consequently the particular will has much more influence on the acts of the government than on those of the sovereign, for each magistrate is almost always charged with some governmental function, while each citizen, taking singly, exercises no function of sovereignty. Furthermore, the bigger the state grows, the more its real force increases, though not in direct proportion to its growth. But the state remaining the same, the number of magistrates may increase to any extent, without the government gaining any greater real force, for its force is that of the state, the dimension of which remains equal. Thus the relative force or activity of the government decreases while its absolute or real force cannot increase. Moreover, it is a certainty that promptitude in execution diminishes as more people are put in charge of it. Where prudence is made too much of, not enough is made of fortune. Opportunity is let slip, and deliberation results in the loss of its object. I have just proved that the government grows remiss in proportion as the number of the magistrates increases, and I previously proved that, the more numerous the people, the greater should be the repressive force. From this it follows that the relation of the magistrates to the government should vary inversely to the relation of the subjects to the sovereign. That is to say, the larger the state, the more should the government be tightened, so that the number of the rulers diminish in proportion to the increase of that of the people. It should be added that I am here speaking of the relative strength of the government, and not of its rectitude, for, on the other hand, the more numerous the magistracy, the nearer the corporate will comes to the general will, while, under a single magistrate, the corporate will is, as I said, merely a particular will. Thus what may be gained on one side is lost on the other, and the art of the legislator is to know how to fix the point at which the force and the will of the government, which are always in inverse proportion, meet in the relation that is most to the advantage of the state.